Okay, so my thesis was the effect of different water depths on the activity of the equine longissimus dorsi muscle whilst walking on a water treadmill, measured by surface EMG. And before I start, I'd firstly like to thank Carol Brizuela for her help and supervision throughout the completion of my research project, and also to wish her a very happy retirement. And I'd also like to thank Claire Dyson for the use of her horses and the equine water treadmill. So, equine water treadmill exercise is becoming increasingly popular for the fitness and rehabilitation of horses. However, many of the listed benefits of water treadmill exercise are based on sort of anecdotal evidence due to the lack of current scientific evidence available. And the current evidence base shows reduced ground reaction forces, increased general muscle mass, increased stride length, and increased limb and spinal range of motion. And one popular benefit listed by many equine water treadmill facilities is to build top-line musculature. And this potential benefit is said to be explained by the bow and string theory due to increased protraction of the hind limbs and increased flexion of the distal joints, creating a flexion of the bow and thus strengthening the apaxial musculature and helping to build the top line. And in a survey, 16% of 41 venues listed building and strengthening back muscles as a desired outcome for a training session, and 32% had used water treadmill exercise to treat, quote, back conditions. However, there's little to no current evidence base to show that water treadmill exercise increases the activity or the size and strength of apaxial musculature. So the longissimus dorsi is a large superficial apaxial muscle spanning the length of the thoracic and lumbar spine, and it was therefore chosen as the most appropriate muscle to measure activity of top-line musculature. The complex anatomy and architecture of the ALD changes along its length and therefore predisposes the ALD to different functions in different regions. The main functions of the ALD are spinal stabilization, lateral flexion, and spinal extension. Surface electromyography, or EMG, has been used as a reliable, non-invasive measure of equine ALD muscle activity in various studies using a dry treadmill. However, the activity of the equine ALD muscle has not yet been measured on a water treadmill. And EMG works by measuring the electromagnetic fields caused by motor unit action potentials produced with muscle activity during movement. So my research objectives were as follows: to investigate how bilateral activity of the equine ALD muscle changes in relation to water depth whilst the horse is walking on a water treadmill, investigate whether there is a difference in activity between the left side and right side of the equine ALD muscle whilst the horse is walking on a water treadmill, regardless of water depth, and investigate whether there is an interaction between water depth and the activity of each side of the equine ALD muscle. So I firstly conducted a pilot study to determine final EMG electro placement, the most effective way of securing the equipment, and to determine the success of the proposed experimental protocol. So EMG electro placement was considered based on previous literature. The point of highest activity of the ALD in walk was reported to be between T12 and T14. However, I did not have consent to interfere with the hunter clips which the horses had. Therefore, in line with lumbar vertebra 2 was chosen as the most appropriate placement, as the second most amount of activity has been found in this area. 4 to 5 centimetres lateral of the dorsal midline at L2 was chosen to reduce interference from the gluteus medius muscle or the lumbar transverse processes, and electrodes were placed 10 millimetres apart, parallel to the muscle fibres, with the transmitter placed caudally, as is shown in the photograph. And a convenient sample of 6 thoroughbred horses we used in the study. This number was similar to previous studies. All the horses were national hunt racehorses in training and were acclimatized to the water treadmill and used it regularly for fitness. Exclusion criteria included horses with known lameness, back pain, or those with previous surgery or major trauma in the spinal region, because these factors are known to change ALD activity. And the horses used were a similar height, weight, body condition and fitness level, making the results more reliable, and the horses all had minimal subcutaneous fat, helping to reduce signal crosstalk. So each horse had surface EMG equipment attached bilaterally to the LD by myself every time. The electrodes were placed bilaterally because previous studies have found significant differences in activity between each side of the LD, as well as muscle asymmetry between left and right sides after a period of regular water treadmill exercise. After attaching the EMG equipment, each horse had a 5-minute warm-up with no water and also a 5-minute warm-down with no water at the end of the session. Measurements were taken for 5 seconds out of the 30 seconds spent at each water depth, and the water depths used were no water, so a control, coronary band, mid-metacarpal free, and mid-radius. 4 different depths have been used in similar studies, and I chose these depths because in my experience they include those most commonly used on equine water treadmills at the moment. To ensure constant and accurate water depths for each horse, I measured using anatomical landmarks and marked out each depth on the left forelimb. Whilst on the water treadmill, each horse paused for a short time between each depth to allow the water and muscle activity to settle, and the assistant on ground level to say if the water depth was accurate to the mark. So in the first session, half the subjects were measured at mid-radius depth followed by mid-metacarpal free depth, and the other half were measured at coronet depth followed by no water. In the second session, 1 week later, the first half of the subjects were measured at no water followed by coronet depth, and the second half were measured at mid-metacarpal free depth followed by mid-radius. And this was done to eliminate the potential effects of fatigue, although it has been found that the LD is minimally affected by fatigue in any instance, and all horses were used to exercising on the water treadmill for a longer time and faster speed than this study required. The treadmill operator, who was me, stayed the same. I stood on the right side of the horse due to the setup of the treadmill platform and kept the horse straight without interfering in the natural head and neck position. And each horse walked at their comfortable speed as decided by myself, and it stayed the same for each depth. The study took place on 2 consecutive Sundays, and as per yard protocol, all horses had been stabled indoors overnight and had not been exercised prior to data collection. So now on to the results. A 2-way Anova was performed to test for a significant difference between water depths in relation to bilateral LD muscle activity. Anova showed there was not a significant difference between water depths. The mean bilateral LD activity at no water was 7.03 millivolts, 7.65 millivolts at coronet depth, 7.77 millivolts at mid-metacarpal free depth, and 8.57 millivolts at mid-radius depth, as shown in the figure. So although no significant differences were found, there was a trend towards increasing LD activity with increasing water depth. However, variation, as shown by the error bars on the graph, also increased with water depth. So this table shows that there was a 9% increase in activity from no water to coronet depth, a 2% increase to mid-metacarpal free, and a 10% increase up to mid-radius depth. This correlated to an increase of 11% at mid-metacarpal free from no water, and a total increase of 22% at mid-radius depth from no water. So a 2-way Anova was also performed to test for a significant difference between the left and right sides of the LD in relation to mean LD muscle activity across all water depths, i.e. regardless of water depth. So Anova showed there was not a significant difference between the sides. The mean LD activity of the left side was 7.41 millivolts and 8.10 millivolts for the right side, as shown in the figure. And this attributed to a 9% higher mean activity level on the right side of the LD in comparison to the left side. And there was also a slightly higher variation of results in the right side. And a 2-way Anova was also performed to test for a significant interaction between side of the LD and water depth in relation to LD muscle activity. Anova showed there was not a significant interaction between the 2 factors. As displayed, each side of the LD showed a different trend in relation to water depth. So the right side of the LD showed increasing activity with increasing water depth, and the left side of the LD showed the highest amount of activity at coronet depth and the lowest at mid-metacarpal free depth. A large amount of variation was also displayed in the left side of the LD at coronet depth and the right side at mid-metacarpal free and mid-radius depth. So the overall results of the study statistically accepted the null hypothesis that the addition of water and different water depths had no effect on the activity of the equine LD muscle whilst walking on a water treadmill as measured by surface EMG. However, there are a couple of interesting trends in the results, which I will discuss further over the next few slides. Firstly, human error in placement of the electrodes are a possible limitation of the study, and accuracy could have been improved using an ultrasound to determine the correct electrode position on each horse. And incorrect placement could have led to increased crosstalk due to the close proximity of the gluteus medius muscle and decreasing the reliability of the results. Unknown subclinical lameness and back pain are also a factor to consider, as they are known to cause muscular activation imbalances and spinal muscle fatigue, which would also affect the validity of the results. Another limitation is that only one breed and gender was used in the study, and although this was done to try and limit variation, a wider range of breeds and a larger sample size would have made the study more representative. And it was concluded that electrode displacement due to skin movement was unlikely to be a limitation due to the tight skin covering and overall low mobility in the lumbar spine. Head and neck position is known to affect spinal kinematics, and further investigation is needed on the effect of this on the activity of the LD. And although head and neck position varied slightly between individuals in this study, no horses exhibited an excessively high head carriage or hyperextension of the spine, and so this was unlikely to be a cause of high variation. And subcutaneous fat and fatigue were not considered to be a limitation in this study due to the experimental protocol and sample described previously. So although no significant differences were found, the present study found a trend towards increasing LD activity with increasing water depth, with a 22% increase in LD activity at mid-radius depth from no water. This contrasts with a previous study, which found an increase in LD activity from no water to tarsal depth before a significant decrease in activity with further increase in water depth. This was the only previous study investigating LD activity at different water depths for a direct comparison to be made. However, the study was performed on dogs, and they did identify differing head and neck positions as a limitation to the study, which may explain our contrasting findings. The trend that was found in my study appears to agree with the expected activity of the equine LD at higher water depths, because previous studies have found increased levels of flexion, extension, and rotation of the spine at higher water depths. And so it's expected that higher activity of the LD is required to produce and both counteract these movements and provide spinal stability. So further research is needed on the effect of different water depths on activity at multiple segments along the length of the LD due to known differences in activity between segments whilst walking on a dry treadmill found in previous studies. Previous studies have found that activity of the LD decreases from T14 to L2, and so this may explain why my study did not find any significant differences, and perhaps a significant difference would be found when electrodes are placed in different segments. L2 was chosen in my study because it was found to have the second most amount of activity in one study. However, these results were seen at fast walk, and my study used a comfortable walking speed. So further investigation could be done into the effect of different speeds on activity of the LD whilst at different water depths. And although it was non-significant, there was a 9% increase in activity and higher variability on the right side of the LD in comparison to the left side. Now, the difference may have been associated with mild underlying lameness that was not detected in pre-checks, the position of the handler on the right side of the horse, as well as their training regime. So all the horses were regularly exercised on a gallops which had an uphill bend to the right. So to conclude, this preliminary study found a non-significant trend towards increasing equine algae muscle activity with increasing water depth whilst walking on a water treadmill. These results are encouraging for further research, as it may mean that water treadmill exercise is able to build algae muscle strength and mass, meaning water treadmill exercise may be useful in fitness and rehabilitation programs to build top-line musculature, to encourage working in a correct outline, to support the spine and rehabilitate spinal conditions, and to develop core musculature as per the bow and string theory. On the other hand, it can be concluded that water treadmill exercise may not be the best method to increase top-line musculature and produce these benefits. Before conclusions can be made, further investigations need to take place. The main recommendation is to carry out an investigation into the effect of different water depths on equine algae activity at multiple segments along the length of the algae, and to investigate the effect of side of handler whilst walking on a water treadmill. So thank you so much for watching. I'm very grateful to reach the finals, and thank you again for your time and consideration. I now welcome any questions which you may have.
Thanks, Izzy. Again, another really fascinating presentation. We're getting some really fascinating stuff today, so thank you. I'm going to pass over first of all to Karen, who's going to deliver the first lot of questions.
Oh, Izzy, that was really interesting and really well presented. Loved your pictures and everything, and I got what you were doing. It's great when you've read it, but to actually see it presented makes it so interesting. What made you choose this project? Because it's a jolly clever idea. And how did you get to this point?
So I ended up choosing this project because sort of over my placement year, I was working in a racing yard which had this water treadmill. And so I got to be sort of trained on the uses of it. And also along with that, a lot of the problems which came in to be rehabilitated, along with obviously the racehorses themselves, both the fitness and issues like kissing spines. So that's kind of where my interest started. Yeah.
Okay, that's interesting. What were the difficulties you found with it? We had one at the hospital where I worked for a while, and I could not believe how much water it used.
Yeah, I guess the general problems of it was like keeping it clean and like the general management of it. We generally found that the horses were really good with like going onto it and walking on it, but I know there is a lot of places where it sort of needs sedation, things like that. But obviously on this study, none of them had to be sedated or anything, so that didn't affect the results. Yeah.
Okay, and what would you do differently? I appreciated your limitations list. I thought that was really sensible, making the different points. And I also thought you were jolly good of putting your measuring devices just where you could, because you couldn't start clipping the horses everywhere. But if there was one thing differently that you could do, what would that be?
I definitely would have liked to have measured at multiple segments along the length of the longissimus, because I think that would have potentially produced significant results, and obviously allowed comparison as well, that would have just allowed for sort of a better idea on how it affects the longissimus.
Yeah, I thought that was good, and you made a really good point that ideally you would use ultrasound to put the devices in just the right place. But no, I think that was a really interesting study. Well done, you. Thank you very much. George, I'm going to hand back to you, and then I'll come back for round two, but I'd give everyone a fair chance, because I have to say Izzy's answered a lot of the things in her presentation I wanted to ask.
Yeah, no problem. So I'm next, Izzy. Just a question kind of following on from Karen's most recent question. you talked about the limitations and you talked about the further opportunities for research. If you could prioritise those further opportunities for research that you talked about, what would you put on the top of your list, and why?
So at the top of my list would definitely be to do the different segments and find the activity at those different segments. And then secondly, it would be to kind of investigate what effect the side of the handler has on the activity. So I found that it was really interesting that potentially me being on the right hand side had an effect on that activity. Another thing that I would have really liked to have done was measure the activity of the rectus abdominis as well, because sort of talking about the bone string theory and knowing that they sort of work antagonistically, I think that potentially we would have found more significant results measuring the rectus abdominis. And so those are kind of the three main points that I would like to expand on, I suppose.
Okay, thank you. That's a good answer. I think it's always, whenever you do a piece of research, it's never perfect. And as a researcher, you're always in an ideal position to be able to say, okay, how can I expand this? So thank you. That was a really good answer. Let me move on now. Let me just consult my list. So Katie is up next.
Lovely, thanks, Izzy. Really interesting study. Do you have any alternatives available for measuring muscle activity? I think it was electromyography that you were using, and it obviously wasn't without its sort of temperamental issues and things. Yeah. Are there other options? And if so, how did you sort of narrow down to choosing this?
So there's also, I think, intraneedling electromyography. So that's sort of a more invasive method of a needle actually sort of going into the muscle. And there is various research on sort of the comparison between the two, but it was actually found that for measuring superficial musculature like the longissimus, the surface EMG was actually good for doing that. But potentially using a different method, we could have measured deeper musculature, like the multifidus muscle, and then potentially would have found significant results there. But again, like ethical issues and such, the surface EMG was sort of the most appropriate method.
Yes, so most practical for you to use, which is fair enough. Do you think more horses might have given you an opportunity to get something statistically significant?
Yes, definitely. It would have been brilliant to have a larger sample size, but unfortunately it was just sort of the practicalities of it.
Yes, no, it's amazing you managed to get as much data collection in the middle of a pandemic and all the rest of it. So, no, well done for that. And I like the fact that you obviously have used it in the past and you talk about it being on the yard. Just presumably the trainer who owns it and utilises it feels there's a benefit as well. I mean, from your experience, have you seen that benefit? Is it tangible, something you can basically see with your own eyes?
Yeah, I think, that you get sort of a lot of progression ticks on social media and things like that. And, like people say, oh, look at how much top line they've gained and all this sort of thing. And so I do think that there is a benefit. We need to actually prove that, because at the moment, water treadmills and sort of the regulation of people using them is quite a hot topic, and there is a lot of people using them that don't have a background in rehabilitation, and so the research is really needed in order to sort of make those protocols to ensure that we're not causing injuries and things like that.
But you obviously believe in it and would recommend anyone to use it, would you?
Yeah, I think it definitely has its benefits. I mean, from this study, I can't conclude that it does have a brilliant effect on top line, and it's not necessarily the best thing to do that. There is much simpler methods and less expensive methods. It does definitely have its benefits, yeah. But from this study, no, I can't conclude.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, Katie. Coming to you now, Liz, do you have a question for
Izzy? Yes, I've got a really silly question, but first of all, thank you, Izzy. You really brought your thesis to life with that presentation. That was great. Silly question, what sort of water is it? Is it just normal cold tap water?
Yeah, it is normal cold tap water. Another thing which would have been good to measure would have been like the temperature, because obviously not so much on the longissimus, but it can have an effect on other things. So that would have been something that I'd like to have controlled better as well, because that's kind of a variable that wasn't able to be controlled.
And is the treadmill sloped, or are they walking on a flat surface?
It's a flat surface.
Yeah. Okay, so. Would you expect to see, for people that, as you just mentioned, it's not a cheap option? You know, do you think it would ever be possible to continue this research and try it out, say, you know, horses in a stream or in the sea, and really make it a bit more, excuse the pun, but mainstream in that sense?
Yeah, I mean, I guess there is that potential, but obviously when you're out of that environment, there's a lot more variables which come into play. Obviously, you can't control exactly what speed they're moving at. You can't exactly control the water height, etc., etc.
Yeah, just an interesting thought. But thank you. Well done. Very interesting. Thank you.
Thanks, Liz. I'm just looking at the time so that we're... Karen, do you have anything else to add, or are you okay? Oh, you're on mute. Oh, you're still on mute. I think you came on.
No, I'm not muted now. No, I think I'm fine, really, in the interests of time. It's really good. I'd love to know about things using salt water and things, but I think that we've got enough covered for now.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you, Karen, and thank you very much, Izzy.
Thank you.
Some good answers, and so yeah, thank you. And back to Claire, please.